Hey, thank you everyone for joining. Welcome to the Melanoma Research Foundation's Ask the Expert series. My name is Debbie Churgai. I am the Education Program Manager at the MRF. We are pleased to have you join us today for this wonderful educational opportunity entitled Stronger Together, Navigating Melanoma Caregiving and Support Services. Today, we will discuss insights on navigating the emotional and practical aspects of melanoma caregiving and learn about the support resources, self-care strategies, and how to build a strong support network. And you will also have the opportunity to ask questions live. Before we start, I just want to share a little bit about the MRF. The Melanoma Research Foundation is the largest independent organization devoted to melanoma. Our mission is to eradicate melanoma by accelerating medical research while educating to and advocating for the melanoma community. The MRF is committed to the support of medical research to develop effective treatments and eventually a cure for melanoma. We know that education is critical for patients to make informed decisions about their care. We have many educational programs and offerings, and they are not only directed at patients, but we create educational materials and events for caregivers, family members, and providers, including educational literature, webinars, animated patient videos, patient and caregiver symposia, and information on rare subtypes, including ocular melanoma, mucosal melanoma, pediatric, adolescent, and young adult melanoma. Our educational literature is all free to download or order for print. You can order materials for health fairs, schools, conferences, and we also send these to physician offices all over the United States. We have 6 animated patient videos and 2 that are currently in production. These videos are less than 10 minutes long and pack in a lot of information with great visual images. If you have family or friends who want to learn more about melanoma, these are a great educational option to send them. Each year, the MRF hosts a series of in-person educational events in partnership with major academic medical centers. These meetings provide an opportunity to learn from leaders in the melanoma community and network with other patients and caregivers. We have 4 upcoming symposia, and you can learn more or register for any of the events on our website under the Events tab. We have over 64 on-demand videos on our YouTube channel. These include past patient and caregiver symposiums. They're all available on our YouTube. We also have all of our past Ask the Expert webinars, and we even have a melanoma educator course. We have a variety of patient and caregiver support services as well, such as patient and community forum, treatment center finder, financial assistant resources, and an Ask the Nurse program. There are many opportunities to support the work of the MRF through a variety of programs, events, and research funding. We host events such as our patient symposias and Miles for Melanoma 5Ks in cities all across the country. And we hope that you will join us at one of these amazing events. If you are interested, please reach out to education@melanoma.org to learn more about ways you can engage in the melanoma community while invested in our shared mission. And the best way to learn about the MRF, including all of our education, advocacy, and research programs, awareness campaigns, and upcoming events, is to follow us on social media. We are on all the big social media pages. And of course, our website to learn more, visit melanoma.org. So before we begin, just a little bit of housekeeping. Sorry. We encourage you to use the Q&A box to ask questions throughout the session. You'll see it, I think it's usually at the bottom of the screen. Please feel free to ask questions anytime during the webinar, but they will be answered at the end of the webinar. The information presented during today's session is for educational purposes, and any individual treatment questions should be directed to your healthcare provider. We encourage everyone to visit melanoma.org to learn more about the resources we have available. And now I would like to introduce our presenter for the evening, Molly Vocino. Molly is an oncology social worker at the Sidney Kimmel Cancer Center of Jefferson Health in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. She completed her graduate studies in social work at the University of Pennsylvania in 2016. Prior to working in oncology, she supported hospice and palliative care patients in the community and in hospital settings, and received a certification as an end-of-life doula from the University of Vermont in 2018. Currently, she works with the melanoma population at Jefferson and co-facilitates a monthly ocular melanoma support group in conjunction with the Melanoma Research Foundation. Molly, it's great to have you here.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. I'm thrilled to be here and spending some time with caregivers. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right. Let's start there. All right. How'd I do? Can I get a thumbs up if anybody can see my screen?
All good.
Great. All right. So again, thanks so much for having me. As Debbie mentioned, I am one of the social workers at Sidney Kimmel Cancer Center at Jefferson Health in Philadelphia. And one of the disease sites that I cover is the melanoma population, and that includes a very strong and diverse population of ocular melanoma patients, but also includes cutaneous melanoma, mucosal melanomas, and some of the other rare subtypes. So, I'm here really to help support our patients and their caregivers with a lot of the non-medical issues that tend to come up when someone is diagnosed with melanoma and undergoing treatment. And that can vary between practical issues, mental health support, social concerns. I wear many hats, and really my role is here to help make sure that your loved ones, the patients, are getting through treatment safely and effectively, and that you are feeling well supported through this too. And I wanted to start just by saying thank you to those of you here that play the role of caregiver in your loved one's life. It is often, unfortunately, a thankless job and encompasses so many different angles and elements, which includes a lot of effort and energy and bandwidth from you and the people around you. And so just taking a moment to hold space for you and really focus on your needs tonight, because they matter so very much. So starting off, I work with caregivers all day, every day. And what I have seen and what many caregivers have shared with me, that they feel often like they're carrying a heavy load, sometimes for the whole family, including the patient themselves. Sometimes caregivers tell me they feel like that pre-existing relationship, that role in their loved one's life, is overshadowed by the responsibilities of medical caregiving. So whether your loved one, the patient, is your spouse, a sibling, child, a parent, friend, that original role and relationship kind of falls to the wayside. Often caregivers feel stressed, overwhelmed, that they have little to no time for themselves and their own needs, or that the needs of their loved one need to take precedent over their own needs. Many caregivers feel more distress than the patient, or at least are sort of able to access that and sort of express that. And this desire to fix things, seeing problems and wanting to intervene and make them better, yet not always having the ability or the resources to do so, that feels frustrating. Often people tell me they feel like a punching bag or an easy target for stress or anger on behalf of their loved one. They sort of take for granted sometimes that you're always going to be there, or just feels easier for them to be angry with you than the thing that they're really angry about, often, which is their cancer. And then guilt with pushing back or setting boundaries with that person. Well, if they're sick, I can't tell them not to say that to me. So in all of this, I think finding ways to shift your expectations and adapting to some of these changes is really the way forward and helping to manage some of these feelings. I will just say quickly for Debbie and Miriam, I talk a lot and I've got a lot of slides and I want to get through as much information as possible. So I'm going to try to go quickly, but if I'm getting close to time or, whatever, just, give me a heads up. Please interrupt me, tell me to move along. So a lot of different sources of stress throughout the different points of care. So, we have all of the factors related to the patient's care that can cause different, sort of sources of stress and distress and strife. And then there's also all of these other life events. Life does not stop in the face of a serious illness. And all of these things are sources of change and sources of stress. And they all impact each other, even if they don't necessarily have anything to do with each other. And that can cause a lot of anxiety. So some expected feelings through all of this and things that are so very common and normal and natural to feel. And this can apply to you and the patient and other members of the family. There's often this feeling of sadness, loneliness, even if you're surrounded by other people or you live in a big community or you have a big family, you have a great work community, you still might feel alone, sitting in a crowded room, but feeling alone. And quality time, between you and your loved one who's the patient may look a lot different now, especially if the person that you're helping to care for is not feeling super well. And so there's sort of layers of loss and grief there. Grief is not always about, the sort of actual or anticipated loss of someone's life, but, a loss of a sense of normalcy, a loss of a sense of what the future might have held, a loss of a person's sort of the sanctity of their health. There's a lot of layers there. There's often guilt that you may feel like you're not helping enough, guilt that you feel healthy or that you are healthy and they aren't, guilt that you can't take away their suffering, certainly anger, which is often sort of this top layer of emotion that is easy to access when really what's often hiding beneath the anger is sadness and fear and uncertainty. But that sort of first line of defense is anger, feeling angry at yourself, maybe feeling angry at people around you, maybe feeling angry at the patient, certainly feeling angry at the cancer and sort of the forces of the universe that have put this situation in your lap. Families face a cancer diagnosis all together, and the person who is the one diagnosed, the one facing melanoma, facing this diagnosis, is certainly not the only one in a family unit that experiences change. And everyone in a family unit has a totally different way of coping, has a totally different timeline, which can cause kind of tension if one person is in one place and another person is in a place of denial or, further along than someone else in finding acceptance and knowing kind of what to do with their emotions. So people, have to sort of figure out and adjust to those differences. And people have a tendency to incorporate information at different speeds, at different capacities. Some people need and want a lot of information, others don't, and that can sometimes be perceived as indifference or lack of concern or caring. So sort of families as a whole, some will sort of arrive at the same stages of acceptance and others really won't. And I think while there's an opportunity, an illness, a major illness can provide an opportunity for sort of healing, mending of bridges, sort of finding an enhanced intimacy or closeness in some of those relationships. Many, if not most complicated relationships will remain strained in some way. Illnesses rarely do resolve or completely solve those long-standing family problems. And again, while there's an opportunity to find some healing, it doesn't always happen in a linear way or at all. And so caregivers are often sort of there as sponges, absorbing and feeling responsible for the sort of collective family strife, which is a lot to carry. A note about nutrition. This is a huge part of the sort of caregiving role is providing sustenance. And I think when we think about cooking and feeding each other in general in our culture in this country and so many cultures and subcultures across the world, preparing a meal and feeding the people around you is, kind of that foundational role, and feeling like you're providing nourishment and love and support. And yet, when a person is undergoing cancer treatment, whether they're on systemic immunotherapy for their melanoma, if they are recovering from surgery, if they are, participating in a clinical trial where there's all kinds of side effects on an experimental drug, often that sort of treatment related appetite disturbance or digestive issues that come along with a sort of major health issue can make this role feel different. And, patients maybe aren't able to eat what they used to, they don't have a taste for it. Maybe anxiety is causing them to have some kind of food aversion. Maybe the location of their cancer is impacting the mechanics of them being able to eat. And so that sort of lapse in the ability for a caregiver to provide a nourishing, comforting meal, and the patient not able to sort of take that in and benefit from that, can really cause these feelings of inadequacy or helplessness. And it feels like this thing that should be in our control. Well, I'll just make this food that I know that you love or used to love, and you'll eat it and it will help, right? It feels like it's within our control. I'll eat the thing and I'll feel better. I'll eat enough, I'll eat the right things, and my health will improve. But there's so many different factors that make this totally outside of our control. And so it gets easy, you sort of can assign that blame on yourself, and that shame and that guilt that, if that meal didn't go well, or they didn't eat, or they didn't eat enough, or they got sick, that I'm at fault. I didn't do well enough, or I failed somehow. And that can sort of really, hold a lot of power over you. So what can we do in these situations as a caregiver? First and foremost, adjust your expectations, right? Know that, okay, there are factors here totally outside of my control. And maybe the goal is not for this person to eat an entire turkey sandwich and a side of chips and a glass of milk or whatever, but maybe it's a few bites, maybe smaller portions and more frequent meals. And I think this, for someone who's not able to eat a lot of volume or doesn't have a big appetite, that big plate of food can be really overwhelming. And even just knowing that there's all this food there that they're expected to eat, it can, cause them to back off even more. So smaller portions, more frequently, lots of snacks in between, things that are sort of things that they have a good taste for, things that are well tolerated and liked, to give them an opportunity to say, have as much of this as you feel like you want. And if that portion is smaller, it feels less overwhelming and they feel more success having just taken a few bites. Approaching those meal times with gentle encouragement, trying to be, find that gentle spirit is hard when you feel that responsibility to make sure that they're getting enough nutrition, but trying not to internalize the response too much or get angry or frustrated. Capitalizing again on foods that are well tolerated, finding hidden opportunities to hide calories where you can, if the goal is to, bulk up a person's calorie intake and, help them gain weight while they're on treatment. So, if they have a taste for peanut butter crackers, maybe adding extra peanut butter in between those crackers, or, if they are able to tolerate creamy soups, adding some extra cream, adding some cream into the smoothie, right? Something that's high calories, that's of course safe in the context of their dietary restrictions, but sort of, bulking it up where you can so that every bite has as much nutrient density as possible. And of course, trying to sort of separate that personal responsibility if they don't eat what you prepare. A note on sexuality and intimacy, for caregiving and caregiver and patient, combos that are spouses or romantic partners, this can be a really huge lapse in the way that you connect with each other while undergoing treatment. There may be sort of physical expressions of sexuality that are difficult due to illness or treatment-related effects. Might be changes to the person's self-image, wherever maybe the primary lesion of their melanoma was, and any surgeries to resect that area. They might not be comfortable with that part of their body being touched or being seen. It might be sensitive, it might be healing. There might be other side effects due to ongoing treatments that are making that part of, their humanity a lot different and more difficult. And that can sort of create some distance, and sort of the role, that like inevitable power dynamic between patient and caregiver can also sort of affect, that sort of feeling of equality that can, sort of affect that part of your life too. And so if you notice any tension there, or it's been a long time since you've been able to connect in that way, find some space to talk about it. Express your concerns, ask questions with that sort of gentle, inquisitive nature that lets the person know, there's no judgment here. I want to know how to help. If there are physical issues that you feel like are potentially reversible, or maybe side effects from medications, talk to the care team, talk to the doctor about it, go slow. Intimacy can exist in so many different ways, and it doesn't always have to mean, sort of in that traditional sense of what you might think. Finding a sense of humor is huge, and sometimes even establishing a deeper emotional intimacy can, help to sort of enhance that closeness when other physical expressions are not possible. Okay, so given all of that sort of foundation of what we know to be common, all the different factors that can affect stress and, affect the caregiving role, it's not at all surprising that caregivers are exhausted and fatigued and overwhelmed and feeling like they don't know how to move forward. And so what can we do about all of that? How can you better take care of yourself? So first, sort of acknowledging and finding some acceptance around the idea that prioritizing your needs is not selfish. In fact, if you don't take care of yourself and you go down, you're no good to the person you're trying to care for, right? And sometimes it takes sort of framing it in that way to spark people to realize, like, okay, it is about me. It's not about me, but it is about me, right? And finding, that source of power and saying, it is important that I take care of myself, because if I don't, what's going to happen to my loved one if I'm not at my best or close to my best to be able to care for them. So it's easy to get caught up in that idea that your needs are not as important and there's not enough time for them. You can get lost in that, and sort of remembering you're not alone. As much as it may feel like you are the only person in the world feeling this way, I guarantee you everything you're feeling is normal, expected, and being replicated all over the place, all over the world, with people in this position of providing care to their loved ones in a medical context. So again, in this idea that prioritizing your needs is not selfish, finding ways to maintain your physical and mental health is truly the best thing you can do for your loved one, first and foremost. Again, so you can be at your best in their time of need. And you never know what is right around the corner and what curveball life may have in store for you at any time. Just because your loved one is going through a cancer diagnosis, it doesn't mean that you might not face some other type of medical challenge yourself. And so kind of being in the best possible shape you can so that you can handle whatever may come your way, and staying ahead of that a little bit. And I think when it feels so overwhelming to care for yourself and you're not sure where to start, going back to basics is an amazing place to start. So those sort of foundational basic needs are often sort of the first thing we let go, right? Eating well, balanced, regular meals, drinking enough water, finding sleep, sort of those basics, showering, right? Taking care of your physical health. It's really easy to let those things go. But then again, those secondary needs, intimacy, recreation, leisure, socialization, spirituality, exercise, all of that is just as important too. And so again, I think reconnecting with what brings you joy and what gives your life meaning is, beyond sort of those basic needs, is also a really good place to start and think about what's missing or what have I inadvertently cut out of my life because I've been focusing so much on my loved one's care. So, sort of putting some of these practices into effect is going to involve and sort of demand communication, right? Talking to your loved one. I think in most cases, the patients are thrilled to hear what their loved one wants to do something for themselves. When I talk to patients about what they worry about most, 9 times out of 10, it's, I'm afraid that I'm too much of a burden on my loved one and they're not taking care of themselves. And so, to talk to them about what you're feeling like you need and what your plan is to put that into place, talking with, someone else other than the patient who you can be open with about things that you're worried about, fears, concerns, frustrations, right? Having that space to vent, whether it's sort of a professional, someone like me, someone on the care team, or a friend or another family member. And then sort of checking in on your self-talk. And what I mean by self-talk is sort of the way that that internal dialogue that you have, the way you talk to yourself. For a lot of people, there's sort of this internal running dialogue, right? And we aren't often or always aware of it or aware of sort of the tone and the tenor of that sort of internal conversation. And yet, if you start to tune in, you might find that the tone of that is kind of overly harsh, overly critical. We hold ourselves to really high standards, and it's really hard for us to sort of check ourselves and not hold ourselves to an unrealistic standard, right? And yet, if you think about the kind of standard you might hold a loved one or a friend that might come to you and say, I'm frustrated by this, or I'm worried, or I'm scared, you wouldn't necessarily be as hard on them as you are on yourself. At least I would hope not, right? So being able to recognize any opportunity to sort of shift that self-talk, to be more kind, more sort of loving and compassionate towards yourself. Setting realistic expectations for making some of these changes, right? Starting really small. I think often goals can feel really big and overwhelming. And just even this goal of I'm going to take better care of myself. Okay, well, what does that mean? Let's break it down. Let's start really small. Maybe you start by just planning on focusing the next week on drinking more water every day, right? Setting a goal for that, or planning to take one extra walk every couple of days, right? Taking a tiny little break. Try to allot protected time for that self-care in whatever form that takes, even if it's 5 minutes. 5 minutes to do a couple of deep breathing exercises, 5 minutes to get a couple of deep breaths outside in the fresh air, 5 minutes to read the newspaper, catch up on your emails, right? You might consider using a calendar or reminder system if you're anything like me. And if I don't write it down or set a reminder, it absolutely doesn't happen. Making a list, schedule for your needs too, and sticking to it, checking things off once you do them. Nothing feels better than crossing something off the list that you've set your mind to do, and then you do it. And, let the people around you know what you're trying to achieve. Enlist your network to help cover you. If your loved one can't be left alone or has a need that needs to be met during a time when you would really like to take care of yourself for a few minutes, see who wants to come over for a visit, and then, remove yourself during that time, right? Use that time to go out and run to the pharmacy, or to take a shower, or to walk the dog, right? And try to do this regularly. A lot of people have people in their life that say, I'm here, if there's anything I can do, right? And it can be hard to figure out how to really put that to use. But if it's someone who has that relationship with your loved one and would want to come and spend some quality time and help to relieve you of some of that supervision or caregiving, consider that, right? So again, kind of getting back to this idea about self-talk, words matter and how you talk to yourself matters, but also the words that we exchange with other people absolutely matters, right? And sort of what we find is that talking about distress often helps to relieve it. And there's often this sort of pressure, this unrelenting pressure, click here, whether that's coming from yourself or coming from some external force, to be positive and productive, and that sort of forced positivity can be really draining, and counterproductive to actually the goal of being positive. When we're told by others, don't worry, be strong, you've got this, just keep going. It's really well intended, but it very often can feel invalidating, right? Like they're not hearing that what you're saying is that you're overwhelmed and you're scared and you're angry. And so you have to sort of, both for yourself and for the people around you, find the words to say, I'm also feeling sad and scared, and I need that to take up some space too. And so both for the people who you're talking to and for yourself, reminding everyone that a listener doesn't have to have the answer. It can feel really like a lot of pressure if you're talking with somebody or somebody is sort of relying on you for support, if you're the listener, to have solutions and answers, right? But often just holding space for somebody else and listening to what they have to say. And also for you to feel like you can open up to somebody and not expect a solution. That helps. Just saying the thing out loud that you're worried about out into the void can help. And, telling and retelling your story, your loved one's story, can help you process it and sort of figure out what emotions are coming along with it, and help to free it from becoming sort of this traumatizing thing that you hold really close and never talk about. So sort of on the flip side of that, talking about your distress can be really helpful, telling your story can be helpful, but at the same time, having to rehash and repeat medical updates to acquaintances, to family members, to friends can be totally exhausting. And so figuring out how to set boundaries is really important too, because while it's good to talk about it, you also don't owe anyone any information any more than you feel like you have the bandwidth to give. And yet you may be the one who everyone's coming to say, what's the latest? How is so-and-so? How are they doing? What's the latest treatment? Are they doing okay? And whether there's good news to share or not, those conversations can be really exhausting, especially if they're folks that aren't necessarily in the inner circle. So trying to sort of consolidate some of the effort of that, maybe keeping notes about those medical updates, copying and pasting into text messages and emails when you can, to sort of reduce the amount of effort it takes to have those conversations, considering sort of a group virtual network for updates, a site like Caring Bridge or a closed Facebook group. It's also just okay to say no or change the subject or screen your calls, letting them go to voicemail, maybe texting back a few days later. It's okay to sort of put up a little bit of a wall there. You don't owe anybody any more information than you feel like you feel comfortable sharing. Not everybody needs your attention. If a person's not adding to your situation, they don't need to be involved. Not right now, or maybe not ever. So people, really do mean well, but they don't really know what to say. So I just offer a couple of suggestions in situations where, peers may offer support in a way that's not helpful. Like, hey, I'm going to come over and bring over a casserole, or maybe they show up at your door with some food. So maybe the response is, thanks for offering, or thanks for bringing dinner over. But actually, what would be more helpful is if you could come and walk my dog tomorrow, or take my son to soccer practice during the appointment. If there's nothing that you feel like they can do that's helpful, maybe just saying, just knowing you're thinking about me is enough and feels, helpful. And that can help people feel sort of purposeful and needed. I think I'm probably okay, yeah. Getting close to time, so I want to skip ahead and get to some practical stuff. So maximizing support from the medical care team, this can be, again, sort of overwhelming. And the longer sort of you're in this world, the more you can sort of, figure out those tips and tricks at your particular institution. Not every team, every institution these days usually has a sort of online messaging platform, but not every team uses it as effectively as another. Typically in oncology, they're pretty responsive on those platforms, but sometimes they're not. So knowing kind of, okay, this team likes to use the messaging platform, this team does better with phone calls, they respond more quickly, and sort of knowing how to utilize those platforms effectively. Keeping a good sort of solid list of names and roles and contact information so you kind of know who to go to for questions. Social workers and patient navigators are great resources for questions if you're not sure who to ask. Even if they're not the right person, they can always sort of point you in the right direction. When those visits come up with the doctor, trying to discuss some of those goals beforehand, taking notes throughout, and then sort of debriefing together afterwards so that no information is missed as much as possible, because those visits are short, they go fast. When scheduling appointments, oftentimes the teams kind of say to you, we've made this appointment at this time, and yet that may not work for you. And it can seem like, well, if that's what they're offering me, that's the only thing that's available. But most times it's not. Asking for options, asking about financial assistance. There are often a lot of resources that are not necessarily liberally explained without you saying, I'm having a problem. Is there anything available? So trying to sort of find those moments to speak up. A couple of websites here, just really quick, that might be helpful for sort of organizing the help you have available. Mealtrain is specifically around, sort of food, and can be really good in the wake of a surgery and sort of preparing for a surgery or in healing from a surgery to sort of, have some assistance with food. Caring Bridge is more about providing medical updates. Give in Kind is sort of all of the above and helping to organize, visits, meals, resources, funding. GoFundMe, everybody knows, for crowdsourcing, financial stress. Asking your care team about options for home health care, whether it's covered by insurance, something you pay for privately, or something that you might be eligible through Medicaid. And if there's specific questions about this later, put them in the Q&A and I can address. And often transportation is really, really challenging for those appointments. And very often, either the hospital or your insurance company may have options for providing rides to treatment appointments, to follow-up visits, and that can help relieve a lot of stress on your end as a caregiver. Accessing mental health care for yourself or for your loved one, having access to an oncology care team is sort of giving you the best of both of all worlds, right? And having access to a lot of different specialists and likely different interdisciplinary care teams to, to help you navigate and get access to care. And that includes mental health care. So I say start with the oncology care team. If you have a great relationship with your primary care provider, ask them to. And if it doesn't feel like formal mental health care, like counseling or psychiatry feels like the right thing, maybe seeking out a peer mentoring or support group environment, helping you sort of feel less alone in this environment. These are just some options for where to find therapists or platforms that you can use to access therapy online. And I think that's it. Thank you so much. I rushed through so much of that. I have just so much always to share, and I hope that we can chat a bit more in the Q&A, but I'll turn it back over to Debbie and see what's next.
Thank you, Molly, for sharing that. There were so many helpful points in there, so many helpful suggestions. Thank you so much. Now we are going to turn it over to our caregiver, Schalon Newton. Schalon is a biotech executive with more than 4 decades experience in commercialization of pharmaceutical and medical device products. Most recently, he was the chief business officer for Trefoil Therapeutics, a company developing a novel therapy for the treatment of a rare corneal disease. Schalon has an MBA from the University of California at Berkeley and a DBA from Case Western Reserve University. Schalon is caregiver to his amazing wife, Julia, and they now live in Irvine, California. Thank you for being here, Schalon.
Yeah, thanks, Debbie. And thank you, Molly, because so much of what you presented resonates very deeply with me, having been a caregiver now for 3 years. And today I'm going to speak as a caregiver to my wife, Julia, as Debbie mentioned. And please understand that because I'm from that perspective, not everything I say will be relevant to those giving care to a child, sibling, parent, or friend, but I hope a lot will resonate. My wife and I began our melanoma journey in 2006. This is when Julia had an initial melanoma diagnosis following a number of basal cell procedures. The 2006 melanoma in her shoulder was removed along with the sentinel lymph nodes, and everything seemed clear. She was followed for 5 years and was deemed to be fine. Fast forward 15 years later, in December of 2021, unexpectedly, Julia experienced a pain in her chest, which led to the discovery of a 5-centimeter mass in her lung. It was not clear if this was melanoma or lung cancer, and this was the beginning of our journey to first find a definitive diagnosis and then to navigate the various options for care that were proposed. This journey to confirm the diagnosis took us to cancer centers around the US. Today, following immunotherapy and a bilobectomy, Julia is cancer-free and is currently training to run in the 2025 New York Marathon. During our journey, Julia utilized various resources such as peer support, counseling, and we both participated in various seminars. However, as the caregiver, I did not take advantage of any of the specific resources that are available to caregivers, many of which Molly referenced this afternoon. I think it's important to understand the emotional impact of a melanoma diagnosis, and that impact occurs for both the caregiver and the patient. It's different. The caregiver and the patient experience the journey differently. And for the patient, they are dealing with mortality and the burden of getting treatment. Caregiver has a very different issue to deal with in terms of contemplating a life without their loved one, which is not an easy thing to do. I found Molly mentioned the emotions you go through, and I found the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross book on grief. Her book was titled On Death and Dying, and she proposed in that book a 5-stage model of grief. And Molly talked briefly about this. And those 5 stages are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And the caregiver and the patient will go through these various emotions in their own way and in their own stages. And sometimes they will be in very different stages. For example, one will be in denial, the other will be in anger. And that makes for a very challenging relationship dynamic, as you can appreciate. So you might ask, and since I'm on this webinar, why didn't I seek support? And first, the suddenness of her diagnosis, which came without any symptoms prior, made our priority to first focus on the immediate issue of the diagnosis, which initially was not clear. And of course, with the suddenness of this unexpected diagnosis, I felt my role was to provide immediate emotional support to Julia in this uncertain time that we faced. The other issue, and I'm a male, I admit I am often prone to keep my emotions to myself. And in this situation, I even found it more troubling to surface my emotions given what Julia was going through. And Molly talked about this, the guilt and not wanting to put your feelings ahead of those of the person who's actually dealing with the disease. So during my journey, I've identified 3 areas of caregiving that I want to chat briefly about. First is emotional support. And this is obvious, right? I mean, you want to be present for the individual that has just received this very devastating diagnosis. And patients don't want to be alone in their diagnosis. So providing emotional support is critically important. Early on, I learned not to say things like, I know how you feel, or I know what you're going through, because quite obviously I didn't. And as Molly indicated, those kinds of phrases really invalidate what the patient is feeling. It's much better for you to listen to the patient and be empathetic in terms of what they want to tell you about how they're feeling. And that listening can be enough for them. It's also important to take on small but meaningful tasks. I think actions speak louder than words, and attending the appointments with your partner is critically important. Handling household tasks, anything that you can do to take the burden of daily life off of them while they're dealing with this thing that they have to deal with. And I think it's very important that the two of you plan positive future experiences, such as family events, holidays, special events. I think it's important to have as much of a positive and future-oriented look as you can to avoid being trapped in the darkness of the moment that you're facing. And I'll tell you that in one of our early dark moments, I remember this well, we decided to purchase tickets to the final Elton John tour at Dodger Stadium. And apparently, this was a period of time where we really didn't think money mattered very much anymore. And so when we finally attended that concert several months later, we were quite pleasantly surprised to see how great our almost front row seats were. The next thing is decision making. And when you're going through melanoma, there's no doubt that you're going to have to make many decisions about diagnosis, treatment, who, where, when, as well as family and financially related decisions. But you need to understand that dealing with these kind of medical decisions, it's not like everyday life. This is not buying a house or a car. You're dealing with mortality and the future of your life together. And so it's important during this time that the caregiver is supporting the patient in making those decisions, not by dictating the decision, but rather providing perspective on the information and the things you need to do to actually support making that decision. Examples are seeking multiple opinions when you have an unclear diagnosis or you're not comfortable with the treatment option that's been provided. So it's important that the caregiver be there to provide perspective on this decision. It's a shared decision, but obviously the patient, I think, has more to gain or lose from these decisions. We face this in choosing to have surgery, or actually choosing to delay a surgery when immunotherapy started working. And we had an oncologist that said that we should wait and defer surgery. And we took this decision 48 hours before the surgery was scheduled. And this was a very unpleasant experience to tell the surgeon who had reserved a major operating theater that we were choosing to delay and continue with immunotherapy. And it took basically both of us acting together to be able to make that decision. I think it's also really important that caregivers support advocacy. Advocacy on this journey is important from day one. And it's important that you seek second opinions. It's important that you understand the care that's being proposed. And it's important that you have input to that and that you ask questions. And sometimes it's difficult for the patient to ask those questions. Sometimes the patient, with the emotions they're experiencing, you can imagine they don't hear everything the same way somebody that's not in that emotional state will. And so it's very important for the caregiver to be present, to take notes, to ask questions, and to just help guide your partner through this process. As I mentioned, I'm speaking from my personal perspective, and I think this role of advocacy becomes even more important if you're dealing with a child or an elderly parent. And you have to, I think, be prepared, and it's not easy to go to raise questions to doctors always, but you have to be prepared to do that because it's your care, it's your family, and you need to get the best possible care. So my final thoughts are, in hindsight, I admit now, and particularly as I prepared for this webinar, that seeking support would have been very helpful to me. It would have removed a lot of my emotional burden, and I think it would have led to a number of less sleepless nights that I had. As Molly indicated, a lot of resources, joint resources exist for patients and caregivers, and these are really valuable, particularly in terms of understanding the disease, understanding the care options, understanding how you navigate the healthcare system. But it's also important that caregivers consider that their own emotional needs need to be addressed, and that they have the awareness to know that getting support outside is going to help them become a better caregiver because they will be in a healthier state themselves. Now, I'll leave you with this comment from my wife, Julia. The best care you can give is to be the rock that surrounds your loved one. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that, for sharing your experiences. And I will say, when Schalon and I were first talking about him joining this webinar, he had said, you know, I didn't really use that many resources. And I said, that's an important story to share, because, you know, not knowing that there's resources, I think, is a very common theme for caregivers. And so real quickly, before we go to the questions, I just want to mention that I did mention some of the resources that MRF has that are for caregivers as well as patients. For example, our patient and caregiver symposium series, I would say almost 40% of the people that come to that are caregivers. Like, patients bring their caregivers with them. So it really is for patients and caregivers. We also have a community forum available on our website where you can talk to other patients and caregivers. And it's very active, and caregivers do like to talk to other caregivers and give advice. And then the third thing I didn't mention in the beginning is right now we have some patient guides that are coming out, and we've broken them up into stages 0 to 1, 2 to 3, and 3 to 4. 2 to 3 is just about to come out soon. But this guide, as well as 3 and 4, will include a caregiver guide in the back of it. So it will be a patient and caregiver guide. So definitely look out for that. It should be available on our website in the Education Institute in hopefully just a few weeks. So with that, again, thank you guys so much for speaking. We just have a few questions that really can be probably for both of you. What do you do when the patient is depressed or hopeless?
And certainly start there. You know, it can be hard to parse out what's a normal emotional response to some really challenging circumstances and what warrants a kind of formal anxiety or depression diagnosis, treatment regimen, outreach for support, formal support. You know, I think sometimes there's a tendency in medicine to sort of over pathologize what's a completely normal and expected emotional response to some pretty crappy circumstances. And so, you know your loved one best. And when you see that change in them, it can be really scary and wondering, like, is this something that's going to pass? Is this something I should worry about? Is this normal and expected? You know, what do I do in that situation? Because it can feel, sort of increasingly helpless when maybe what you had done in the past to help encourage your person, help cheer them up, help to brighten their day doesn't seem to be working. And again, that can kind of fall back on you and feel like a personal failure. So again, I think engaging the care team, if there is a way for you to have a private conversation with anyone on the team to share your concerns, if you're worried about how your loved one might react, talking with them, letting them know what you're noticing, and not necessarily using words like depressed if you're worried about the impact of that or the stigma, but letting them know, I've noticed that you've been more down. Is there something on your mind? Is there anything you want to talk about? And recognizing that you might not be the person that they feel like they can talk to about that. And that doesn't mean that they don't love you and appreciate you, but they already may feel like they're burdening you, and they may not feel like they can open up to you in that way. So maybe seeing if there's somebody else either in your life or on the care team that they might feel comfortable opening up to.
This next question is for Schalon. We had someone says, you had mentioned that in hindsight, getting support for yourself would have helped. And the question is, they wonder what good support would have looked like for you. Would it be therapy or a support group or a patient navigator? What do you think that support could have been?
Yeah, so what I didn't, I mean, Debbie touched on the fact that I've worked in the biopharmaceutical field. My wife worked in the medical device field. And so we fortunately have experience. We read journal articles, and even though we knew nothing of oncology, we were not afraid to get in the journals and learn about it. So we were fortunate in that regard. So we had that. Both our sons work in the healthcare field. One of our sons works at the Knight Cancer Institute, and he put us in touch with people that we could talk to. So on all of that side, we were very fortunate and unique. When I say that I would have liked support, it really is on the emotional side, because I was afraid. I didn't know how to talk about what we were going through. The contemplation of a life without my partner, kept that all in. And I think and that's why I say it led to so many sleepless nights lying in bed, running this stuff through my head. And so, retrospect, for me, the thing that probably would have made me healthier mentally would have been able to speak to probably a professional counselor, or maybe another caregiver who had gone through a patient with a similar diagnosis.
Thank you. um, what do you think the main anxieties that melanoma patients experience? What do you think some of those might be? And this is probably either for either of you.
Well, I think melanoma has a deservedly bad rep, right? I mean, melanoma is not a great thing to get. And in the case of my wife, with her desmoplastic melanoma, we know for a fact that 10 years ago, before immunotherapy came on the market, she would have been given a death sentence. I mean, that was not a type of melanoma that you could deal with. And yet now, somewhat paradoxically, and this is where medical research is so amazing, that type of melanoma now is actually the best type of melanoma to get, because it is, basically fully responsive to immunotherapies. And so I think the uncertainty of the types of melanoma that you have is really a stressor. And in our case, and some melanoma is hard to diagnose. In the case of Julia, we never actually got an official diagnosis. We had to piece together the puzzle with little bits and pieces, that the material had a UV light signature, et cetera, et cetera. And the fact that the tumor material from 2006 was not saved. They could not go back and examine that. So I just think melanoma is a very difficult one. And then, we all know there's mucosal melanoma, there's uveal melanoma. So it's not a catch-all phrase when you say melanoma. The stress for patients with these different types of melanoma is quite unique and different, and that can make it more lonely, right? Because it can be harder to find people, and I dare say we would probably be hard pressed to find somebody that went through something highly similar to what Julia went through.
I agree. I think that uncertainty of what you're about to face, what the options are, do I have the right information? Do I have access to the right care team? Especially that feels daunting in the beginning when you have some information, but not all about what you're facing and what the future holds. And so I think that, that uncertainty about what's going to happen is a huge stressor.
Yeah, I mean, within the first 30 days of Julia, so Julia had this mass discovered on December 5th, around Christmas time, when it was still not clear whether this was lung or melanoma, she was told it was inoperable. And so at that moment in time, over Christmas, great time to have this happen, we were really looking at a situation where we didn't think there was a real viable treatment option for her.
Wow. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned how much things have changed in the last 10 years too. I mean, it's really, and that's why, education, research, funding is so important for cancer, because just to think about how far we've come in 10 years is amazing. We just have room for really just one more quick question before we end it. And I want to get all your thoughts, and if anybody wants to mention anything in the chat, please do. But do you think, what kind of caregiver support is missing? Do you think there's anything missing that we maybe could create, or, you know, do you just feel anything that there's missing for caregivers?
I think my impression is that, because I over the last week, I've done a fair bit of research on this, and it looks like there is very positively increased focus on supporting caregivers. I mean, there are now more mentoring programs where caregivers can meet other caregivers. And I think those programs, do we have enough of them? I don't know. But I think the fact that this is now a recognized concern is good. And I think, MRF is doing a great job of starting to expand their programs out to address caregiver issues.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. Any final words, Molly?
I just want to address, there was a comment in the Q&A box that, it really resonates with me about, the sort of the contrast between sort of what we traditionally think about in cancer support services in the initial phase of sort of the acute nature of initial diagnosis and getting through an initial stage of treatment towards a curative intent, or, through that active first stage and how intense it can be. And then on the flip side, sort of adjusting to terminal or later stage illness. But what about this in between? And like you said, those advancements in medicine towards melanoma have created a lot of scenarios where people are living long-term with, incurable stage 4 melanomas, doing well on longer term immunotherapies, and yet there still are a person living with chronic illness. And what does that caregiving look like? And trying to focus more on that sort of like long-term sustained wellness for both you and your loved one, and what can that look like? And so I think those conversations remain really important.
Thank you. Thank you for covering that as well. With that, I think, I'm going to be respectful of everyone's time. So we're going to end here. I want to thank all of you for joining us today, especially our speakers for presenting today during this session. We appreciate that, all you do for the melanoma community, and appreciate you taking additional time to be with us this evening.